What's going on, everyone? Musky season's just around the corner, and I wanted to go over my musky leaders because musky leaders directly influence how your baits work. And so I have 3 of them that I've kind of broken down, and they do everything that I need. I always keep these 3 leaders tied on to 3 different rods, and it allows me to throw every single bait that I have. First leader that I want to talk about is fluorocarbon. This is super simple. This is a classic leader. Most people just run these for everything they use, but I like to use these for my rubber and my fluorocarbon. So whether I'm fishing like things like these big tubes, if you're fishing big tubes, if you're fishing big, any big rubber, all done on fluorocarbon. I use the fluorocarbon also for a lot of the baits that don't really need any action implemented into them. In that case, I'd actually use, like, for example, with lures like glide baits like this, or any dive and rise baits, I do all of that on a mono leader that I tie. So this one is, this is 9 inches of monofilament tied in here with a crazy Alberto knot, and then I tie it with a figure 8 knot down here. So this leader is actually completely neutrally buoyant. So in the water, this is actually a new one that I just tied on, so it's still got a little bit of a bow from the shape that it was sitting on the spool. But when you get this wet, it'll actually memorize to being perfectly straight. So it allows you to implement perfect action into the nose of the bait. The other thing too is braid is buoyant. So braid will float on its own. Monofilament sinks slightly. It's a common misconception that monofilament floats. It actually doesn't float, it just sinks very slowly. In the crazy Alberto knot, there's actually enough braid here to float the nose of the monofilament. So this leader is completely neutrally buoyant. What that allows you to do is when you're fishing baits that have nose action, whether it's lateral or up and down, on the pause, your leader isn't pulling the nose of the bait down. On leaders with swivels, the swivels are actually heavy, so you have to picture them as a weight off the nose of your bait. On every pause, the swivel sinks down, throws a V in your line, and then in order to move the nose of the bait again, you have to pull the slack out, and then you can move the nose of the bait. It gets the bait moving slightly when you start to put this tension when you're pulling the slack out of the swivel, and then when you go to pop it, it's already moving, so it's a little more delayed and sloppy. You don't get those nice sharp cuts that you can get when you use this monofilament. This monofilament's perfectly neutrally buoyant. On each pull, it just hangs totally still. When this monofilament memorizes its shape for being perfectly straight, it acts as a straight wire. I know a lot of guys like to use straight wire leaders for fishing jerkbaits because you can get those nice sharp cuts out of it because it's straight. The only trouble with that is that they sink. So this, you get the same benefits as a wire leader, but it's neutrally buoyant and doesn't affect your baits at all. This is about a 130 pound test monofilament. Super cheap, super easy. You get a little nick in it, you tie a little figure 8 knot, and then you pull off 9 inches and tie on a crazy Alberto knot, and boom, you're back in business. Super cheap, super easy. If you ever get a nick in it, this leader is for anything. Just to put it simply, this leader is for anything that has nose action, or you want to implement action into the nose of the bait. That's also applicable to walk the dog topwaters. If you're trying to get the nose of the bait to cut side to side, this leader. Up and down, like bobby baits like Sufix, if they're going up and down, this leader. I'll then go to the fluorocarbon, this is sort of the hardy leader. It kind of just does everything, super versatile. I'll throw all of my crankbaits and rubber on this because you're not actually trying to implement any action other than pull and pause typically, or some rips. Having the heavy swivel on the front doesn't really affect that because the baits are so big and heavy and you're just swimming them through the water anyway. You're not actually trying to implement specific action into the bait. This also works well for like prop bait topwaters, that sort of thing, that just you're not overly concerned about making the bait do things specific. That's when I'll run this. The third leader that I like is my bucktail extension, is kind of what I think of it as. This is blades, strictly blades. The only thing that I throw on this is bucktails. The reason being is it's really short, so it works well for if it's pulling in a straight line. So what happens when you hook on blades is when you're reeling it in a straight line, it actually becomes an extension of your bucktail. I use 240-pound single strand wire, so it's slightly thinner than a traditional bucktail wire, but as you can see, it's almost the exact same. So from the hook all the way up to where your braid's tied on is all one big extension of your blades. I make all my own. You just twist them up and shrink. I put a little piece of shrink wrap on there just to prevent the braid from nicking if it comes in contact with that curved piece of metal. But this is an extension of my bucktail. And the beauty of this for fishing blades is it doesn't hinder any of the vibrations that are coming off the blades. If you were to use monofilament or fluorocarbon, it actually dampens the vibrations. You can visibly see this in the water as well as feel it in your rod tip. You can even hear it. When you're using these leaders, you can actually hear your blades on a calm day if it's quiet around. You can really run short leaders too, and the reason that I run them so short, this is a 5-inch piece of 240-pound stainless steel with a 1-inch swivel. These are the VMC swivels. These are the ball bearings. You pay a little extra for these swivels, but they're the best. They're by far the best. They'll last forever, super strong, super smooth too. Because some ball bearing swivels actually have a lot of tension, and as soon as you put tension on the ball bearings, they don't spin anymore, but you don't have that problem with these. So you pay a little more for them, but they're better. Always keep a few spares of those. When I wear out my leaders, I just cut them off the swivel and retie the swivel onto my next leader. With this, you run them short. This swivel's about 1 inch long, so 1 inch plus your 5 inches, 6 inches. It's a little more because I run the split ring here, about 6 1/4 inches. Traditionally, that's really short. The reason that this works though for blades is because you're reeling them in a straight line. So the fish typically come up behind blades, and the only thing that you run the risk of bite-offs when you're using blades is if the muskies actually fully overtake your blades, and then in which case this is here to save your braid. Having the 5-inch leader, 6-inch leader lets you make really wide turns in the figure eight. When you're fishing blades, you're just dragging them around in a circle, so it's good to have your bait really close to your rod tip. So it lets you get really close, it lets you make really wide figure eights, and it also translates all of the vibration from your bait into the water, and it doesn't dampen it. That's why I really like these. This is my bucktail extension. It literally just extends the length of the bucktail, and you catch definitely a few more muskies every year because of this. The other thing too to keep in mind is jerk baits don't spin, so they always run true, where if you were to run blades without a swivel, you'd foul your line and it would be terrible. And the other thing too is a lot of rubber rolls. So if you're fishing tubes and you give it a big pop, they actually tend to spin in the water. So you want a swivel on there. Fishing crankbaits and rubber, the swivel doesn't hurt it at all. As well as when you're fishing blades with the wire, you're always just pulling it steady in one direction. So the swivel never has time to sink, and it doesn't affect blades either. You need a swivel on blades, no effect. When swivels do affect your lure or your lures though, is when you're trying to implement nose action. So if I'm using a glide bait and I'm trying to pop the nose out this way and then pop the nose out this way and then pop it and work it like this, you need a leader that doesn't sink down in the front, because what happens on every pause with fluorocarbon, or if you have a swivel on there, is this sinks down, and then in order to pull the bait forwards, you've got to pull the slack out of the leader and then it moves. But by the time you've pulled the slack out, the bait's already moving and you get way sloppier, way more delayed, and it just doesn't work right. All right guys, so the 3 kinds of leaders that I use, simple categories. Number 1, my monofilament jerkbait leader, 130-pound monofilament. This fishes all your jerk baits, all your baits where you're trying to implement nose action, whether that's up and down, side to side. This is your bait, jerk baits. And then I use my bucktail extension, my blade extension, only for blades. The only time I use this leader is for fishing bucktails. It's an extension of my blades. It's got a swivel on it, so if my blades start to spin, it doesn't foul my line. And it's short, so I can get maximum figure eights, but that doesn't hurt it because fish tend to eat the bait from behind, and they never really come in contact with the leader because it's always in a forward motion. And then lastly, we got good old faithful fluorocarbon. and that's basically fishing all your pull pause baits, all your crankbaits, anything that makes its own action, and you just fish it, swim it. Fluorocarbon is perfect for any of those scenarios. The other thing too is I do run a swivel on all that because, like I said earlier, has no effect on the baits and it just prevents any line twist. So there you have it. There are the 3 musky leaders that I use. If you try this, you'll definitely see a big improvement in how your baits work, how your baits run. Just a little trick, I think, that'll put more muskies in the boat for all of you guys.